So, at least for, so anybody want to kind of give any summary points from last night for those who missed yesterday?
Please, yes.
We kind of just briefly, we talked about the state of the world, the state of the church, the state of church planting. That was a big part of it.
It was depressing at first.
And then the whole talk was very depressing. No, the stats were depressing. And then kind of shared an overview. This was, I don't have time to kind of go through the same thing, but took a deeper look at V3 when we train church planners, we're trying to let them have a grounded spirituality, missional theology, and movement ecclesiology. Mm-hmm. So we looked at each of those in a little bit of detail. And today...
Hey, JR.
Yes?
Also recap the church's industrial complex. That was my favorite point.
Oh.
Yeah.
Just high level. Just briefly, a high level. Yeah.
High level.
Oh. Well, I mean, it's, highly resourced. It's like where, I forget the nice quote that I have in the book here, but if you think about, hold on a second. Maybe there is a kind of a quote that is helpful in particular.
There were 4 characteristics, right?
Product.
So the,
Of course, notes.
just a second.
Um,
Yeah, so, I guess in the introduction to our time, it's like we all tend to look, at the world, at Jesus, at the church through a set of eyeglasses, right? And so what we've kind of inherited, in my thinking, is the church's industrial complex, which is a resource-driven form of church that has a gravitational pull to unintentionally turn spirituality into a product, church growth into a race, leadership into a business, and attendees into consumers.
Do those again.
The church's industrial complex is a resource-driven form of church that has a gravitational pull that unintentionally turns spirituality into a product, church growth into a race, leadership into a business, and attendees into consumers. And so we're trying to say, what does it look like to see the church through the lens of movement? And we kind of did an overview. When it comes to movement ecclesiology, like one holistic gospel, 2 places of witness, or neighborhood and network. There's 3 elements of the church. So if you had to kind of think of the church in her kind of simplest, in both her essence and function, communion, community, and commission is one of the ways that you could describe that, kind of using a little bit of Henry Nouwen's language there. Then we talked the 4 spaces of belonging, which is a big part of what we're going to go into more deeper today. And then there's the 5-fold intelligence. So in particular, the functions of the apostolic function, the prophetic, the evangelistic, the pastoral, and teaching function. We'll hit that in our next session. So today, we're going to dive deeper into the 4 spaces of belonging. And I kind of entitled this, and by the way, I'm kind of sharing with you guys how we would train a church planter that is kind of starting out. And again, it's trying to divert from what a lot of them inherited in different ways. And I think we have to, take the good what we have, but also be open to what God has. Because the things I'm talking about aren't new to the church. They're in the foundation. We can see them in Acts. We can see it in many different places of the world. So it's not kind of unique to me. But I want to today, some of you guys were here on the Friday afternoon, and I kind of posed 4 questions to you, 4 questions I have been pondering for probably the last 10 years. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I think these are important things for us to think about, whether you're leading a church, whether you're kind of leading a business, whether you're leading a band, it doesn't really matter. I think they're important for us to consider. So the first question is, do I have a life worth imitating? Paul said 6 times, imitate me as I imitate Christ. In other words, throwing all mask aside and casting off any sense of false authenticity, Is the life that I am currently living worth imitating? Have I discovered a way of life that I would gladly invite others to live into because it is that good and beautiful? Is my life rooted in the love that knows no boundaries? Is my hunger for significance grounded in the divine that transcends my current sense of failure or success, inadequacy or gifts, scarcity or abundance? Have I discovered the joy that can pierce through disappointments, disasters, distractions? Do I have a deep yearning for what is real? Is the pathway that I'm on allowing me to increasingly live in peace and be patient with people amidst the flurry of activity around me and the demanding deadlines ahead of me? In those moments of thick silence and disrobed solitude, could I say with the Apostle Paul, "Follow me as I follow Christ"? Or is my life more reflective of the underground man and Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground and some of his later work? You see, the underground man lives in a world divested of transcendency, and thus he is left to scratch and claw for meaning in a horizontal framework apart from the vertical. This does not mean that the vertical disappears. It simply is redirected to the horizontal plane. The underground man moves from feeling superior to inferior in his hyper-reflective mode of being. Unable to be grounded in the divine, he is left a prisoner to envy as he compares himself to others. As an ultra-conscious man, he envies the man of action, even if the unreflective man of action is engaged in self-defeating actions. In the underground, the opinion of others becomes ultimate. In my observations, the ultra-conscious person rightly prizes faithfulness, but wrongly denounces fruitfulness. While the unreflective, active person prizes fruitfulness, but primarily to build a tower that happens to have their name in bright neon lights at the top. Jesus seems to value those who desire faithfulness and fruitfulness, those who have been purified in their desires by joining him in his death and resurrection. As Paul, the redeemed Pharisee, put it, "Indeed, I have been crucified with Christ." This is the Message translation. "My ego is no longer central. It is no longer important that I appear righteous before you or have your good opinion. And I am no longer driven to impress God. Christ lives in me. The life you see living is not mine, but it is lived by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. I am not going to go back on that." Legitimate self-reflection with intentional soul care lends itself to a life which is both faithful and fruitful. Do I have a life worth imitating? It really kind of starts with that. There's nothing more foundational in my mind.
What's the biblical reference to crucified with Christ?
It's Galatians 3:20, I believe. Do we have a community worth joining? And by the way, if you, as these are building upon each other, and I would say the second one, if you do this, you cannot help but probably attract people. Who doesn't want to be around a community of love and joy and peace and patience if we actually learn to do that together, right? Whether you lead a church, business, or band, leaders quickly recognize the need to cultivate a culture which increasingly gives people a sense of belonging. For in the beginning was community. The Father, Son, and Spirit in this unending dance of mutual enjoyment. The most fundamental reality of existence is community. We were created for community. Yet the underground man and woman still live in prison by the laws of the underground, where revenge, resentment, and rancor run rampant, having inherited a way of life which leads to isolation and alienation. Dostoevsky describes underground living well. He says this: "There, in its nasty, stinking underground home, our insulated, crushed, and ridiculed mouse promptly becomes absorbed in cold, malignant, and above all, everlasting spite. For 40 years together, it will remember its injury down to the smallest, most ignominious, spitefully teasing and tormenting itself with its own imagination. It will itself be ashamed of its imaginings, but it yet will recall it all. It will go over and over every detail. It will invent unheard of things against itself, pretending that those things might happen, and will forgive nothing. So how do you cultivate a culture where each person is appreciated, accepted, and valued for who they are? Where conflict is considered a normal problem in human relations, but unresolved conflicts is considered abnormal, detrimental, and destructive. How do you rise above the destructive laws of the underground and become an apprentice of Jesus and learn the craft of forgiveness and reunion which is found in him? How are you rooting yourself in the love of God and experiencing forgiveness so that you can love and forgive others? The one who lives with grudges and bitterness simply reveals they have yet to tether themselves to Christ in his death and resurrection. New life and deep community is found when the law of love is observed and when we find mentors who help us transform conflict into life-giving opportunities for creating constructive change processes that reduce violence, increase justice, and direct interaction in social structures and respond to real-life problems in human relationships. So do we have a community worth joining? Third, if we, again, these are progressive, is do we have a mission worth dying for? You know, only when we have thoughtfully wrestled through the first two questions are we more likely to approach our mission in a way of life which no longer unintentionally hurts to purport those we want to help. What do you need to do to turn youthful, tainted zeal into a pure zeal for our Father's house and name? When one understands that at the center of the universe is a missionary God who is seeking the renewal of all things, it changes the way that we approach mission. John tells us that the one who is called the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. In a world where we're tempted to extend our ministries through video church, we're invited to follow Jesus, who left a realm where time and space had no consequence in order to live in a particular time, in a particular space, with a particular people. How should the knowledge of the incarnation shape the people of God in the digital age? An invitation to faithfulness is about adopting a posture that acknowledges that God initiates mission. What practices would allow you to discern the work and whisper of God among the people in the place that you have been called? Mission is recognizing the beauty and brokenness in the places we live, responding to the hurts and the hopes of the people to whom we have been sent. And let me just propose that if we increasingly have a life worth imitating, if we increasingly have a community worth joining, and we have a mission worth dying for, I would say that you want to see that spread all around the world.
Right.
And so the fourth question is what we're multiplying easily reproducible? If the first question is personal, the second one relational, the third one missional, this is the movemental question. So first we should ask is what are we wanting to multiply that's worth producing? If it is, then faithfulness ought to blossom into fruitfulness and multiply across the earth. For the commission that was handed to us by Jesus is both local and global in nature. Movement requires reproducibility. So how do we engage in systems thinking so that discipleship moves from the peripheral of what we do to the very center? It is simple to make complex and complicated. It's simple to make things complex and complicated to make things simple. Let me say that again.
Yes, please.
It is simple to make things complex and complicated to make things simple. How do we create simple structures which makes what we're multiplying reproducible by just about anybody? Minimalism is creating space which allows us to put our energy and emphasis on what matters most. Clearing away the distractive debris. How are we focusing on rhythms of life that help us to live into communion, community, and commission that we've been given? As we take the time to reflect on these four questions, we can better learn what it means to die daily to the underground man and woman and live as resurrected communities. For in him, all things are new. That was a little bit of a reading because it was more of an article I wrote, but we'll kind of talk a little bit.
That was 600 words a minute. That was a gust of 600 words a minute.
That was my gosh, yeah. I did say that the average person speaks about 150 words, but we can hear 800 to 1,000, and I tend to do 300 to with Gus up to 600. So hopefully you can follow along. All right. So again, if we can answer these first questions in an increasing and affirmative way, then we really do have something worth multiplying, and I think it's important to then think about this movement ecclesiology. So I want to kind of first go into why have a movement ecclesiology. I think we learn something when we kind of think about people's last words and final words. I know Ben's at a place where he's with a lot of people that are having final times. But George Orwell, the author, said, at 50, everyone has the face he deserves. Vic Morrow, an actor, I've got to be crazy to do this shot. I should have asked for a stunt double. Dominique says, I'm about to, or I am going to die. Either expression is correct. He happened to be a grammarian. Billy Sunday said, don't be in such a hurry. And W.C. Fields, I'm looking for loopholes. So, as I think about the last words, what were some of Jesus' final words? You've probably given messages. In particular, it's interesting some of the words, after his resurrection and before his ascension. But there was one big theme. There are multiple things he talks about, but a pretty major theme that is unavoidable is this, whether we're in some of these are the Message translation, go into the world, go everywhere, and announce the message of God's good news to one and all. I mean, you got to be, there was something that happened to them that was so exciting that this would have been made sense to them, right? Peace to you. We just read today, as a Father has sent me, so I send you. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then Acts 1:8. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so these are some of Jesus' final words. And then as we already reflected upon today, I love this. I'm going to look at the Great Commission, and as Matthew puts it, but this is kind of a combination of the Message and Dallas Willard's personal translation. So it kind of gives a fresh look. Jesus, undeterred, went right ahead and gave his charge. God authorized and commanded me to commission you. Go out and make disciples far and near in this way of life, submerging them in Trinitarian presence. Then instruct them in the practice of all I commanded you. I will be with you as you do this day after day, right up to the end of the age. So what do we learn from Jesus' final words? Some of his final words. He's given us a mission to the whole world. That's a pretty big task. And I would say that, the only way to be faithful to that command is to be fruitful. And we don't control the fruit, but we control how many seeds we plant and how much we water. And God causes it growth. But if I'm kind of planting and watering and I don't see growth, I'm definitely going to live in that tension because I know this commission that's collectively been given to us. Does that make sense? So not only did we talk about last night, is there a need, but Jesus himself, this is the commission that he's given us as the people of God. And so, now I remember as a younger pastor, pastoring my first church, I would go to, I don't know if this happens at Episcopal church, but when I would go to a conference, people would ask, how many people go to your church? That was the first question. And I just now, in that case, I feel like success quote was a little bit reductionistic in its view. And so for me, I kind of started to think about maybe some better questions we ask each other is how many people are becoming more like Jesus, demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit in their life? Or how many people are seeking to live in the world for the sake of the world in the way of Christ, as we kind of were reflecting on in our passage? Or how many churches has your church been involved in planting? Are any of the first churches that we read about in the Bible still in existence today? No, none of them are. They all died out. Churches, like people, have a lifespan. Maybe they're a little bit longer than people, but they have a lifespan. And the church will die if we don't reproduce ourselves.
Right.
When you have a family or people get married, probably within a couple of years, maybe you give them a little time, but like if you're the parent or whatever, probably, hey, when you guys can have kids? There's kind of this expectation of children, right? I think that is the way it should be with churches too. Healthy churches have children. Healthy churches reproduce. They can't help but do it. And I want to kind of talk about that a little bit on why that is important, why church planning is important. Established churches tend to see 3.4 baptisms per 100 members annually, where new churches tend to see 11.7 baptisms per 100 people. So there's that.
May I ask a question? From a time perspective, how do you define established versus new church?
That's the next slide. All right.
Okay.
Churches plateau in attendance by their 15th year. It's difficult to replace members as they lose them by the 35th year. The more established a church is, the older the average age of both its pastor and people, often far older than the surrounding community. Did you guys find this stuff to be true? Churches under 3 years old are more fruitful when it comes to conversions. They see about 10 per year. Churches between 3 and 5 years old are half as fruitful when it comes to conversions. They see about 5 a year per 100 people. And churches older than 15 are the least effective when it comes to conversions, about 3 per 100 per year. So, what does it mean? These are just, I could go on with these statistics, by the way. If I had time, I would share when a church plants a church, how it actually, studies have shown it's actually healthy for the mother church. It actually gives her more energy. And so, some people have done their master's study on that type of thing. So, I'm really kind of trying to think about looking at the church through the lens of movement, because it's, to me, the only way that we can be faithful to the commission that we've been given. And so, what is movement? I think one of the places that we see movement was in China. When Mao Zedong took over in 1949, there were 2 million people who self-identified as Christians. What did Mao do when he took over? He banished all the foreign missionaries and ministries. He nationalized all of church property. He either killed or imprisoned all second and third level leaders, so you guys would be gone. He banned all public meetings of Christians with the threat of death or torture. In other words, there was no public space. He proceeded to perpetrate one of the cruelest persecutions of Christians on historical record. Now, that all happened starting in 1949. He dies in 1976. The question is, what would they find when the bamboo curtain opened up in May? How many Christians were there? What happened with the church? There were no seminaries. There was no central structure. There was no public space. They were pushed down to the underground to kind of, they could only live in social, personal, and intimate space. Otherwise, they were going to get in trouble. What they found by the early 1980s, after opening bamboo curtain, instead of 2 million, there were estimated 60 to 80 million people who self-identified as Christians. One of the reasons is that because every Chinese believer believes that they're a church planter, and every church is a church planting church. I'm not asking you to necessarily agree with that theologically, but I'm just saying that's their belief and part of why. Now for them, church was this social space. It wasn't this big complicated thing that we've kind of made, it was a very simple form of church. They were forced to be simple. In other words, in the potential of the seed is a tree. In the potential of the tree is a forest. Here's kind of my attempt to define church's movement, kind of using some language we've talked about. Movement occurs when we answer our call to live in communion with God, and out of the overflow of our life with Him, we live into our sentness as a community, carrying out his commission to be a sign, foretaste, and instrument of his kingdom in ever-expanding geographical areas. Now, with that being said, it's easy for us to feel, I think, disoriented in our world today. We talked about last night, and we're in this fourth turning, the crisis moment. If that cyclical view of history is correct, we certainly does feel like it. And it seems we live in a fragile world. And if fragile things break when exposed to stress, the opposite of fragility wouldn't simply be that things don't break, like stay the same, but things get stronger under stress. And we don't really have a word for this. So author Nassim Nicholas Taleb came up with, and here's how he came up with a book called Anti-Fragile, and that's how he defines this. Anti-fragile is when disorder, randomness, and chaos come along. Fragile systems break, and robust systems stay the same or eventually return to the status quo. But anti-fragile systems don't just survive in chaos, they thrive in chaos. So in these days of cultural upheaval and growing instability, I think we need to reflect on this concept of anti-fragility and see if it opens up fruitful pathways for a new kind of spirituality, a new kind of church. What worked for before may not serve us in the days ahead. What if there were a way of holding to the Christian faith and spirituality in an anti-fragile way? What if there was a way not just to survive the chaos, but to thrive in the chaos? Now, I love hearing kind of any metaphors that kind of help us understand both the anti-fragile element and the sense of movement. Have you ever heard of the immortal jellyfish? Yeah, that's pretty cool. Like I just heard about it through a friend recently, but Alan Hirsch was talking about the immortal jellyfish, the original expression of anti-fragile. It swims around the ocean, and when it's under threat, it dissolves into protoplasm and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and then out of the protoplasm comes thousands of new jellyfish. And the metaphor here is that under crisis, living systems invest in reproductive capacity, the ability to reproduce. Like if you prune a tree, the tree thinks it's under attack, so invest in better seeds and better fruit because the chances for its survival is multiplication. What did Jesus say about the church? Upon this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I do like the King James version in this particular one.
May I ask a question? Where did that word church come from in Hebrew? Is that, will I build my synagogue? Will I build my temple?
Yeah, I haven't looked at the...
There hadn't been church
Yeah.
until after Jesus, so
Sure.
What's the word?
Ancient Greek word would be like ecclesia, so like the gathering
Yeah.
of Christians.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is that the word that's used in this particular?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Let's see.
Yeah, it's kind of the ecclesia would be, it's more of the concept of like calling the city, to, be together. It was a very citywide type of thing.
Ecclesia means the calling out of people.
Okay.
The called out people.
So I want to talk about today like the anti-fragile church, the church as movement. But let's first kind of look at a couple of quotes. J. Oswald Sanders writes, "A great deal more failure is the result of an excess of caution than a bold experimentation with new ideas. The frontiers of the kingdom of God were never advanced by men and women of caution." Tom Kelly, more of like a business guy, says, "Experimenters delight in how fast they can take a concept from words to sketch to model, and yes, to a less than polished prototype." We kind of need to kind of be, we look at, Hans Kung's thoughts yesterday, some other people that just talk about this need for innovation, this need to kind of, from a rootedness, a sense of rootedness, but innovation. So I want to talk about this movement ecclesiology. So this is just a quick overview. There's one holistic gospel, 2 places of witness, 3 elements of the church. I'm going to hone in on the 4 spaces of belonging this session, and then we're going to hit the 5-fold intelligence in our next session. So the spaces of belonging, the 4 spaces of belonging. This is something that was discovered by the sociologist Edward Hale in particular in the 1960s, popularized by my friend Joseph Smyers in his book, The Search to Belong. This kind of comes from the Church's Movement book. But essentially, intimate spaces that 2 to 4 people that you tend to be closest with. So just for a minute, why don't you get up and just get around 2 or 3 people, make a circle just for a moment. 3 or 4 people. 2 to 4 people. Okay. No more than 4. And all right. I just want you to get the sense of like when you're in the size of this group, like what. This is kind of where again when not just any size, but with this in particular, we're it's a place where we can be more vulnerable, that we can let our hair down, if you will, where we can share the good, the bad, the ugly, and all of that. Because there's a trust element that's developed, right? But it's the proximity of intimate spaces closer, the number of people is less. Now move into groups of 5 to 12.
Come on in.
This is just to keep you awake, right? 5 to 12. Now you're in, this is personal space. In personal space, again, what sociologists discovered in the 60s, Jesus lived into. He confined with the 3, he trained the 12. Now, if you were getting the Great Commission, if you were a part of the 12, and then Jesus says, go and make disciples of all the nations, do you think you'll probably reflect on how did he do it with us? Because Jesus was not just the ideal disciple, he was the ideal disciple maker. He understood that there's something about this space, this personal space, partly what happens, as we imitate each other, which is a very human thing. There's something about this space, this personal space, that allows for training to happen well. He chose 12. It wasn't just that they symbolized the 12 tribes, but I think it was a sociological reality as well, as sociologists have discovered. These spaces are spaces every human lives. The question is, what happens in these spaces? We were talking about, like one of, I think it was Blake's wife was, or somebody mentioned on Friday afternoon, like everybody's getting discipled. Everybody's being discipled by somebody and something. So, do you believe that Jesus is a person that people need to look more like? Is there something about Jesus that has attracted us, that we want to try to pass on to others? How are you doing that? Where does that happen? For Jesus, this was the key space. Yeah, they were with him in all the spaces. They're all important. But this was where the training took place. This space was by invite only. It wasn't open. It was a closed and bounded set. We'll talk about that as opposed to the center set. Now get into groups of pretty much everybody. 20. Get around a big circle for a second.
I like people.
All right, in a circle though. In a circle, big circle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, so when we're in a circle, let's just kind of imagine we're in someone has a big house, and we're in the house, and we're eating, and people running around. What I want to say is that this space is ideal for mission. It's a space where we bring our Christian and not yet Christian friends together. If I invite them to the personal space, I can read the room and feel the room. And if I'm like the only non-Christian, do you think I'm going to feel like I'm apart? That would be very difficult. Like pretty quickly, if there's not already a little bit of wall, that's naturally there. Like I don't know of anybody that's like me. And maybe I'm kind of around you because I'm searching a little bit. That's even subconsciously.
That's the cheese stands alone.
But if we're all in a house and we're having a dinner and maybe somebody's sharing a quote that is it's just a place where we're bringing our Christian and then the people who don't self-identify as Christian together. This is the best place for that. Because everybody, if you got half, and ideally, it's probably half-half. Now, who is kind of the host of this space? It's the group of 12. The personal space is kind of within. So maybe we have like 6 people here in the middle here, just for illustration. All right, Peter, go. Few more. All right. So if you want to think about a movement ecclesiology, I would suggest it involves personal space within the social space. They are the hot center. If they desire Jesus, if they desire to be more like Jesus, what we have found is that as we give the people who don't get self-identified as a Christian a place to belong, they actually start to mimic our desires, the heart and the host of the group. And if you desire God, you desire His kingdom, if they look up to you, if they see something in your life that they admire, they will start to imitate your desires. That's a little bit of Gerard in my second book. I go into a lot more detail of that reality. People will imitate our desires very naturally. Whoever we look up to, we model their desires. So, at the center, there's this core thing of the discipleship group who are people committed to be like Jesus. And they're hosting this social space that has maybe half the people that don't self-identify as Christians and half that do. You can host it. You can also maybe 2 by 2 become a guest at an existing social space. But social space is where mission takes place. Personal space is the best place for discipleship. That's all I wanted to kind of illustrate. Again.
Hey, JR, can I make an observation?
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people in this room have also been to like Fresh Expressions conferences, and to me, like dinner church is really big in that. Is it fair to say that like dinner church exists as a good example of social space?
Yeah. Dinner would be a great kind of template.
Yeah.
One template for social space. But if you don't have personal space within it will not be long lasting, and it will not put discipleship at the center of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I don't, to me, again, just look at how Jesus used the space, but if you have personal, we all want to see more people look like Jesus. It's going to happen in this space. But in that space is kind of hosting a social space. It could be, there's many templates that we talk about.
JR?
But the key that I want you to get is that one is inside the other and helping to build it.
I just wanted to point out that people that have been in DCBI, that just made me think of apostolic core.
Right.
Cool. All right, so again, I don't know about you, but if I were one of the 12, and all of a sudden Jesus left me with this huge commandment, I'm probably thinking like, what did he do with that? And again, he confided with the 3, he trained the 12, mobilized the 70, that was basically mission space, if you will, and then spoke riddles to the crowd, or parables.
And the social space is also where you can be doing like outreach and mission, right? Or like working together.
Yeah. Maybe there's, in your group, in your disciple group, like there's a really passion for some social justice activity or whatever.
Work with the food bank or.
Then, yeah, it's bringing your friends that also have a passion for that. They may not self-identify as Christian yet. Anything, yeah, in fact, that's the difference between us, mission is us to them, to us and them together, right? Is us together.
JR,
Yeah.
does this apply to both? I think there's like implications of more example-led evangelizing, but also classical evangelizing, oratorial.
Okay, so yeah, what I would say when it comes to social space, this is just, so first of all, it's important to make a difference between the framework and then the freedom within that framework. might like be the bones of the body, but the skin, is based on your context, based on the leaders, based on what you want to do there. However, with that being said, I like to think about there's social space as either a connecting space, a sharing space, or a challenging space. There's different levels. If it's a connect, because you want to define that, because then people know who to bring to that space and what the space is for. I don't want to bring, if I think it's a connecting space and then all of a sudden it turns into a challenging space, that may determine who I invite. And I may feel like, hey, I wasn't kind of expecting this. So so there's a connecting, which is just like, there's nothing overly spiritual about it other than the fact that we are spiritual people and that should naturally flow. But it's just trying to have a time to connect my Christian and non-Christian friends together.
You're saying that what type of space the social space is connecting, sharing, or challenging is intentionally set up as that?
As that, right. And what I'm suggesting, what I would suggest is that it remains either connecting or sharing and not a challenging space. And I'm trying to define what I mean by those words. So connecting is just connecting. Sharing, it could be kind of light sharing. So there's some of our groups in social space, they have dinner, it rotates between the people who are in the discipleship core. And then someone speaks about 10 minutes. And it may be a quote that, we shared a bunch of quotes. Could be like a Bible verse, could be whatever, but like what is something that's really motivating and life transforming for you? And by the way, I think that could be opened up to whoever. It could be, it doesn't have to be the people who self-identify as Christians. It could be. It depends on your nature of what you want it to do. That would be sharing, maybe low-key sharing, and maybe high-key sharing would have a little bit more of the Jesus story in there. But challenging is actually when you kind of, like you read in Acts and so forth, blah, 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 blah. Now what are you going to do with this? There's space for that. However, what I found is like, if social space is more in this connecting and sharing, the ideal, and we do talk about this later when kind of getting really practical about it. It doesn't matter, we can talk about it now and probably doesn't hurt if we repeat it. But like, let's say this is social space. Half of you, don't identify as Christians. Half of you do. That's the ideal social space. What has been helpful is like, okay, we get it, like it's growing, it's thriving. I was telling my host, one of the things I did in LA when I started there, we had maybe 5 of these spaces going within the first year of our plan. But I also kind of wanted just to experiment even more as an experimenter with just doing another, I want to do a group with just people that I met in LA. And whether they were Christian or not, didn't matter. And I had about 4 people, and all I did was I bring them to a dinner. We ate together. We had a little wine, or California is more wine. I'm into whiskey now, but like we had wine, and all we did is one person shared their life story. Like, what were the 3 or 4 moments in your life that were most transformative, that make you who you are? That was like, we didn't have any time on it, so it went fairly long, like 2 hours sometimes. Now, as a person who, is kind of, it started with 4 the first week. Every week it grew. I didn't do anything. I didn't invite any more people. Every week it grew until about 3 months we were at over 20 people. And that's all we did. But what do you learn in that? Like, what happens to the relational connection? As a person that's more kind of apostolic, what's their passion? What's their gifts? How might they live their life in this space? Because when we talk about the fivefold is in all humanity. It's only when we give our answer our call to Christ that He then gives us as people with that vocational intelligence to the church. But these people are out there. People have these intelligences already, and I'm already identifying without ever naming it, without ever teaching about it. I can see it once you learn to identify it. It's like an Enneagram. You see it everywhere. And you don't use it against people, but So you guys get the idea. So that's, did it, oh, so to finish the question is like, so if you guys are non-Christians, what I would do is like have this 4 to 6 week formal bridge that would be more of a challenging space, but in a casual way, maybe dinner, maybe it's kind of methodically going through the good news, maybe someone shares a little bit of their own testimony, maybe there's even a little Bible study there, but they're to be invited for that in particular. Like, you know, it could be just called Jesus Conversations. We're going to learn more about Jesus and why does he matter to this world, or whatever. It could be around the justice-oriented thing, but what is it that motivates us for this? You know, we want to talk about what motivates us for this, what you know, helps us to see this. Whatever that 4 to 6 week looks like, you want to be sharing the gospel, and at the end actually challenging. But you don't invite all of the people. You just, because the disciples, you know, because you're praying, everybody in the core has some type of communal rhythm of life that deals with communion, what helps me fall more in love with Jesus, community, what's helping me be tight with others, and the commission, what helps me to live on mission well. So if we all in that 12, circle of 12, if we all decided part of our rule and rhythm of life together is to pray for at least 5 people who don't self-identify as Christians every day, and once a week we have coffee or tea with them. When we host a social space over a period of time, do you think that social space might grow? Now, you know, what if someone, I don't know, like I've never really, you know, this is where discipleship comes. If people are having a hard time living in rhythm, then, hey, why don't you come with me? Come to dinner. It's like, it's super, you know, friendly. I remember one of the people in LA that I met, you know, he was like really a hardcore atheist. That was just his view. We would meet, you know, pretty often for lunch. Over time, like maybe a year, he kind of became more agnostic. And then he started asking, he started wanting to do good things in the neighborhood. Like he just had this hunger for justice we talked about. And so he came to, who do you think he came to? Like, you know, hey, you're part of church, so what are you guys doing justice-wise that I can get involved with? Whoa, where did that come from? Does that sound like Cornelius, who helped the poor and God was already working in him to the point where he was ready to hear the good news? So what I'm looking for here is each of us have people over that are not self-identified as Christian, and I may be closer with these 2 or 3. You might be closer with those 2 or 3, and so forth and so on. And so you're to discern, you know, who is it you think is ready to be invited to this more challenging space. Okay, when I was in Hawaii, I think I told you guys last night, I kind of went there during COVID for 14 months. And so I joined one of our church plants there. And it's led by a co-vocational leader. So they're like part-time physician, and then they're also planning this church. First year they started, they were able to get, you know, a solid discipleship core together and build a community of about 50 people. Second year, that group multiplied from 1 to 3. Now, I'm not saying that that's the type of growth you can expect, but I'm just saying that's what happened. However, like as I was participating, and their template of their social space was beautiful, it was very simple. It's actually what I told you, like they do a dinner, someone serves 10 minutes, you talk at the table. You know, my table was probably, you know, some Christians, non-Christians, but we talked about pretty deep things because people like to talk, it's amazing. Kids had their own little table and playing in the background, so it was a kids thing too. And but as I was talking to the planter, I said, you know, I realized that they kind of multiplied 3 groups, a lot of connection to a lot of non-Christians, but only one person that had come to faith. And I thought, like, for me, I thought, like, I knew, so I was there. There was 10 of us in the house that lived there during COVID. And on Wednesday nights, we invited guests. And so some of the guests that came were part of this social space already, right? And I had people asking, literally, it feels like, tell me what is it about this community? Like, what's unique about them? Like, they were asking me to basically share the gospel. I mean, it was, as an evangelist, like, you can kind of know when people are ready to be birthed into a new world, like, and you might have to help the process, right? I've been there literally hundreds of times with people. And so you kind of know what it means to come alongside that. These people were ready. They had no structure or system to kind of help them kind of really think about it deeply. And so I told, they started a bridge. They out of the group, out of about the 50 or 60 that were coming to social space, they invited about 12 of them and took them through this 6-week thing. And every single one of them decided to become Christian. And then guess what? That group became a new discipleship group. And they, by the way, already had webs of relationship which were mostly people who didn't self-identify as Christian. So how fast do you think that space had the potential to grow? Over the third year, that group of 3 had multiplied to 9 groups. This is church's movement idea. It's not complicated, but it is important to understand these 4 spaces. I'm trying to give you like a framework, and then you need to kind of think about the freedom within that framework. The framework is what happens in these 4 spaces. Some of them deliver certain things better than other things. And I'm trying to suggest what those are. Now, with that said, how many of you guys are familiar with Marshall McLuhan? Yeah. Have you read this book here? This is, I was kind of rereading it because I was moving recently. But it's a small book. Oh, it's not it. Oh, yeah, here it is. But it's called The Medium is the Mass Age. You guys read that one? It's an amazing book. Number one, there's a lot of pictures, so you can read it pretty quickly. Number 2 is like, this was written like 1963, and he is using terms like global village. Other things. You can see he saw the internet before it, way back in '63. He's considered the father of media studies, right?
Excuse me, sorry, were you being funny, or I thought the title of the book was The Medium is the Message?
No, it is the mass age, but the term that we usually use, the medium, is the message, but the wording is mass age.
Mass Age.
MASSAGE, but it's kind of meant to be mass age, the global, that's kind of the behind it. I know, it's like, we do get from him, the medium is the message, which is essentially the heart of his message. And here's a point. He says, all media work us over completely. They are so pervasive in their personal, political, economic, aesthetic, psychological, moral, ethical, and social consequences that they leave no part of us untouched, unaffected, unaltered. The medium is, in this case, the mass age. Any understanding of social and cultural change is impossible without a knowledge of the way media works as environments. All media are extensions of some human facility, psychic or physical. So he goes on to talk about, basically a medium is an extension of ourselves. The phone is an extension of the ear and the mouth. The book is an extension of the eyes. The car is an extension of the feet. Now think about that. Think about that one medium, the one invention of the car. Now think about cities that were before the car. New York City, San Francisco, they're walking cities. Now think about the thing after the car. Los Angeles, Atlanta, they're not walking cities. They're like spread out like crazy. One thing, and how did that shape us? Like when I lived in LA, I lived in East Hollywood. Now, a lot of my community lived there. Not everybody, but and then some maybe work a half hour away, and the people that they work with work another half hour away, and like this creates some discipleship issues. We had to become creative. That one medium reshaped how it feels to live in the city. Now, what people who have studied, and by the way, I talk about this a lot more in my first book, Creating a Missional Culture, and why we need to understand the primary medium of the day. Because essentially there's really only been 4 primary mediums of the day. And when that changes, everything changes. Everything. And so for most of world history, we lived in an oral society. This is a picture I took when I was in Kenya. I've been there 6 times. We have a foundation where we do microgrants to help small businesses there. But when I'm there, and I'm in the Turkana region, which is like the least visited place, but now that they have oil there, there's new flights coming in. But when I was there, most of the people in the Turkana tribe are nomads. And they go around in groups of 200 to 300. And all the men are like, raise goats, maybe some other animals, they're all shepherds. And and it's very a desert area. And so when the vegetation is gone, they just up and move the whole tribe. They're still an oral society. None of them read. And I realized this kind of power of the medium when the one of the, there's some pastors, so some of the people I was connecting with or had been reaching out to them, and so this group had some pastors. The pastors had the word richly in them. Why? They had no book they could go to store it. The only way that when they heard a story, they had to internalize it. They had to internalize the word in order to keep it. They always learned in the context of physical flesh and blood community. Some of you can remember when there was no smartphone. How many phone numbers did you know? How many do you know now? We can barely remember our own, right? Because we put it on another device. Like the medium shapes us, shapes how we learn. Now the printing press is invented, and now we're readers. Now even the very act of reading shapes us to be more individualistic, because now I'm not learning in a group of flesh and blood community, which is the primary way that you learn in an oral society. Now I'm kind of off on my own within my book. So this actually creates a more individualistic person. Not only that, but if you're reading in English, it's just a bunch of squiggly letters put together to create words that we kind of memorize and symbolizes some reality. We read left to right, and so this kind of activates the left side of the brain, which is kind of more linear, right? More sequential, more rational. But when you read, if you're a Jewish person and you read in Hebrew, this guy knows some Hebrew here. Yeah, they read the opposite way. Guess what? That creates it changes the brain. The synapses in the brain and the right side of the brain where creativity, metaphor, and so forth is activated. No wonder when I lived in LA, a lot of Jewish people were in the industry. They were artists, they were creative. Every time they're reading their scripture, they're activating the right side of their brain. This is the power of the medium. It literally reshapes our brains. Then we move to the broadcast era, radio and TV. And now we live in the digital age. Now what's interesting is we live in a time that's unlike any other time, because we have some people, maybe some of you that were that were kind of more print oriented. You read newspapers, you read this, everything needs to be physical and print. Some people are in the broadcast age where that's kind of where their heart of their shaping happened. And now, kids grow up, with a phone. And by the way, that device does become a part of us. I can tell you because when I was just in South America, and I was in Buenos Aires, I was sitting on a sidewalk, chatting with a new friend, and had my phone in my left hand. Someone just grabbed my phone, ran up the road, jumped on a bike that was already driving, and there my phone was gone. It wasn't so much about losing the physical phone as much as, oh my gosh, all my data, everything, my whole life is on this phone. I just felt like somebody took a part of me out. It wasn't like the thing itself, but it was it felt a part of me, right? Media is very powerful, and I think we don't realize the power that it has, because it often happens and works invisibly. Let me give you kind of some example of the medium is the message idea. I was visiting this church in Chicago, And they met in the round. And that's not necessarily uncommon. Like, I think there was a certain time in church history that was just the thing, right? So like a total round, there was like an aisle that went north to south, and then an aisle that went east to west. Now, when I came in that community, like, and by the way, and then there was kind of a, the center was kind of there. Where do you think the communicator stood? If you had to make a guess. But maybe, we think, I'll go in the center because I want to be able to communicate. There's something about communicating. If you can, connect with their eyes and so forth, like it makes it more vibrant. So, but no. What they did is, if we were in that big circle, they were on the, I don't know, east or west part, and they were on the edge of the circle.
Right.
What was in the center?
Table.
The table. Yeah. The table, the bread, and the wine. Drink this one, I don't get to, but like. Now, I'm coming in for the very first time. What has already been spoken without a word?
The table is central.
Yeah, table is central. There's something that the center of their community is represented by this bread and this wine. What was represented with the preacher? Because some people had to turn their heads. Why am I preaching from the circle?
You're part of it.
Pardon?
You're part
Yeah,
of it.
I'm a priest communicating to other priests. I just happen to be the person bringing you the word today, but I'm a part of you in the same way. Like, the medium is the message. No matter, sometimes we have a message that directly contradicts the way the medium is speaking, and we wonder why we don't get anywhere. The table. Jesus' favorite piece of furniture was the table. I mean, he probably went to the cross for his table manners, who he ate with and who he connected with. Because you guys know, like, eating at the table was fundamentally saying, I am a part of you and you're a part of me. No wonder it was such a controversy. Much deeper. I think the table is significant. We have one guy here in the church. It's called the common table. Like, there's something about a table, there's something about eating, and this is kind of why we recommend, like, when we're once a week, part of the rule and rhythm life is connecting with someone who's not Christian. Just eat with them. You'd be surprised on that itself, what that is building relationally. Jesus kind of modeled it for us. He had the table here, he had all kinds of, he was more around the table than any other place. The table is a medium. I'm just trying to get this concept of medium, the car, all of these things shape things, the primary medium of the day. What I want to suggest, and we've kind of already talked about this, but structure is a medium. The structure, we create structure, and structure recreates us. I want to suggest that, each of these spaces does something well and not some things not so well. And for example, I'm not going to get if I come to public space with the goal of getting my intimate needs met, I might leave sorely disappointed. If I come there to get my sense of deep community, that's more likely to happen in social space, not public space.
Social media space too.
Huh?
Yes. People are going to public space, social media space,
Yeah.
for their intimate needs.
Yeah, true. Yeah. No wonder there's an epidemic of loneliness, right? And so, I'm not like a Luddite against all, social stuff. However, like, when you study the power the medium has, then you're very careful on how you utilize things that you utilize and how, what to do and what's primary. Because, we use the media to kind of extend ourselves to the whole world. Jesus was already connected to the whole world, and he decided to be confined to a human being, to a particular place in a particular time. What does that say to us in a world where we're constantly expanding ourselves? But if a church doesn't have social space, for me, I have a hard time getting in. It's not going to probably happen on Sunday. Maybe I'm an aggressive type of person. I can meet people, like that. I'll introduce myself. I'll take the risk. I'll take rejection. But I'm going to do that. And I go to some churches that they have public, and it's hard to break in. Like they already have enough relationships. They're overly flowed. But if they have a social space, that's an easy space to connect. Especially if there's food, especially if it's in not a church building. Where remember, the medium is the message. Where you meet, how you meet, makes a difference. And I will talk about that in our last session. But I need to move on. So for us, like, intimate space is about going from being unknown to known. That's the goal of that space, to really share the good, the bad, the ugly of our life. Personal space is moving from small groups to equipping disciples. We talked about some of the distinctions of that. We'll talk more about that in our last session, or second to last session. Social space is going from communities to communities on mission, where half of you are Christian, half are non-Christian, like friends, however you define that. And then with public space, and I'm not going to talk about this much because you guys don't get all that set up, but I think we need from moving to idolizing, to demonizing, to reimagining. Idolizing maybe the mega church, maybe other people, like whatever reason they idolize the space. House church could demonize it. I think the public space has a space. Each of these spaces are important, and they're each bring something unique to what is developing in the community. Now, with that being said, which space do you think most churches in the U.S. will devote their time, their energy, and their resources to? Public, yeah. Some people say 90% of the type of energy goes there, and then maybe if they have quote small group, I'm trying to really redefine that area, they would have personal space, and they have personal space so that hopefully that will kind of create a more vibrant public space. I think the tail is wagging the dog. Like, where do you think Jesus, if you look at his life, where did he devote most of his time, energy, and space on? If you had to pick. Personal, right? Personal, and within that personal were James, Peter, and John. Like, so within that group, those are the people he said, I'm going to be with you. You're going to be with me. He defined what that discipleship meant. Now, in that time, like, they literally left everything and had a lot more time to connect. And they were with him in these other spaces, but that was a special space for them. When he's speaking parables to the crowd, the disciples, hey, can you give us a little clue what's happening here? They didn't help them, for the most part. Still half blind by the time, even Peter, right? You are the Lord. Don't go to the cross. Get behind me, Satan. What's happening there? Right? There's always a sense of blindness, but each of these have a purpose. And I just want to suggest that this is where you can be most vulnerable. And I would consider, like, everybody who maybe part of what it means to be in the discipleship for is to have an intimate space. I'm not going to dictate who that is because that is something that might take a long time to do. And the reason it could be helpful because if you are thinking movementally and these get multiplied over a period of time, one of the big tensions that people have is like, do I have to make all new friends every time we kind of multiply? If you can keep your intimate space forever as everything else multiplies. So you can have a little stability within that while still keeping space open at the table. And so personal space, again, training disciples, invite only, we'll talk more about that. Social space, again, we as we pictured it, hopefully you realize, that's the best place for new people to come in. That is the front door. I don't want to go to, if I'm a non-Christian, and I was a non-Christian up until right before my senior year in college. There was nothing about the church that made me want to go. I knew some people, but they didn't seem much different. They told me, there's 101 things I prefer to do on a Sunday morning. But, I recently became a Christian. But in that space, I had no desire to go to this meeting, and I certainly, as a non-Christian, didn't want to walk into what felt like a different world, which is partly what we are creating, is a space that we see a promise of a new world. But, you know what I'm saying? The language, everything's so different, it just wouldn't make sense for me as the first place that I would park myself. So, if you don't have places that are dedicated for mission, for your Christians to be non-Christian, then do you think that you will see more people become Christians or less? if you're not curating space for mission, I would say I can tell you probably the trajectory of the growth of your church in general, as it relates to new Christians. Maybe you have a public space that's growing, but is it just transfer growth from other churches, or is it growing from actually connecting with people who don't know Jesus, who you want to come to know Jesus? So, structure is a medium. What I'm telling you is a framework that you can choose to appreciate and live into, or you can deny it at your own peril. But if you want discipleship to happen, I think it's understanding this framework is super important. And if you want missional disciples who actually know how to connect meaningfully with those who don't self-identify as Christians, then you have to structurally tie personal space to social space. You can't loosen those and pull them apart. When it's structurally tied together, it creates missional disciples. Not just people who study the Bible and know the Bible well, but actually start to love their neighbors in an increasing measure. And reflective of Acts 1:8, there's kind of this going out into new spaces. We have to be movemental in order to be faithful to the commission that we've been given. All right, let me see.
J.R., can you go back there to the last slide?
Yeah.
And just, if I could share just a second, as I've been reflecting on this concept for the past few months, as it operates in the Episcopal Church, for one, I think it's a helpful diagnostic tool of our parishes, of which spaces do we have, and what functions are we trying to fit into that space. So I think, first of all, a lot of us try to fit everything into the public space.
Yeah.
Which, every single function, which is helpful. And then, especially those of us who are from smaller congregations, we may have 20 to 50 people, but again, we're trying to make that operate as public space.
Yeah.
It's like the thing as Episcopalians, we know how to do well because we know how to do worship, we know how to do community. So it's really helpful just to look at how we do our entire thing.
Yeah, great. And I know I'm way over time, but I haven't really been following my notes that well, but
I think we're good.
that's all right. So the key to movement is this, I think, personal within social space. If you can grab a hold of that and remember kind of what we talked about, that will, if you decide, well, hey, we're going to experiment with that. I don't think get the whole church to do this. Find a few people you think would willing to jump in this with you and do it on the side in parallel to what's happening. You don't have to disrupt. There are some people that may have no desire for this. I don't see the need to force change upon people. I woo people. And when this group happens and stories are happening, hey, and they multiply, do you think people might ask, hey, what are you guys doing there? Like, can I be a part? Well, we're starting something maybe a few months. Like even in social media, like there's some things that start out like, invite only, right? And everybody, we get an invite, give me an invite. There is something kind of that is kind of naturally beautiful about that. Anyway, this is key. Now, let me just kind of give you an example why this is important. I got to figure out where I'm at in my note. Which of these people do you think most people are more familiar with? Okay. Who is the better preacher? Whitfield. Yeah. I did my PhD at University of Manchester in England. And we had Wesleyan scholars there, and there's a lot of people who say Wesley studied Whitfield, like really deeply. And everybody agreed that Whitfield was the better preacher. Whitfield had slightly bigger crowd. But why do we remember Wesley then? Well, they moved. Because I want to suggest that
Wesley broke away.
Well, the difference is Whitfield was totally devoted to the public space.
Right.
And Wesley got to the point where he would not come and preach unless you set up bands, classes, and societies. Guess what size those were? Bands, 3 to 4 people. Classes, 12. Societies, 50. He lived into this reality even before sociology was discovered. Who do you think he might have learned that from?
Jesus.
That's why we remember Wesley more. He left the movement.
He wouldn't come preach somewhere unless you did that?
Yeah, at some point in his ministry, he got to that point. It wasn't at the beginning. And here's from the journal. Wesley says, I was more convinced than ever that the preaching like an apostle without joining together those that are being awakened and training them up in the ways of God is only begetting children for the murderer. How much preaching there has been for these 20 years over all of Pembrokeshire, but no regular societies, no discipline, no order or connection, and the consequence is that 9 in 10 of the once awakened are now faster asleep than ever. He understood the need for discipleship. He also knew that transformation happened in these other spaces more than his public space. Whitfield says, my brother Wesley acted wisely. The souls that were awakened under his ministry he joined in class and thus preserved the fruit of his labor. 'Tis I neglected, and my people are a rope of sand. 90% to public space, 10% to whatever else. Where does movement happen? Tails wagging the dog. Social space or public space, I think, is kind of designed to speak into often the ideology that people are captive to. Not everybody uses it that way. Some people are captivating them to an ideology. We know that. Just look at how many people will be voting for Trump. I'm not trying to get too political here, but that are in these spaces. So we need, if we're going to see more people who look like Jesus, live like Jesus, we have to have these other spaces. This space exists for the sake of those spaces, and for the multiplication of those spaces. Yeah. So again, he had Bland's classes and societies. So for, basically it's a bounded set within a centered set. And I'll just kind of lead with this, and because I am way over, you guys pulled me into conversations.
Great.
So anthropologists have these concepts of bounded and centered sets. Paul Hebert, both an anthropologist and missiologist, kind of brought these concepts to the missional conversation. Probably people like Michael Frost, Alan Hirsch, and Daryl Guder, who was a professor at Princeton, helped to popularize these concepts. So in order to kind of understand this, there's a nice illustration. So Frost and Hirsch used the analogy of the fence and the wall. So let's say you're raising cattle and you just have 3 acres. You would likely kind of build a fence around the cattle and to keep the other animals out. But if you're a rancher with a huge amount of land, unable to build a fence around your entire property, you would dig wells instead of building fences. And it's assumed that the cattle will not wander too far away from their source of water. In the same way, personal space is a bounded set. It's by invite only for people who desire and want to learn to be and make disciples. That's part of it. Not just to be a disciple, but eventually to make disciples. You're starting the process with the goal of you having to disciple. Now, yeah, that's another thing to say. Like, if you're coming to a group, this personal space, and part of that commitment is that you will help to kind of start another personal space. Do you think the learning of the person might be activated in a different way instead of if I'm just coming to consume this group again? Another place of consumption. There's a clear sense of who's participating in the group and who's outside the group. And so while personal space is a bounded set, the social space is best lived in a centered set as indicated by the dots. There are no insiders and outsiders. It's a place where everybody can belong. The center of this group is Jesus, and as represented in the community of disciples, right? There may be some people outside the circle moving toward Jesus and others inside the circle moving away from Jesus. Social space is to help people discover the living water that Jesus offers all of us. I'm going to stop there, and I've just totally messed up my whole element, but I think the point is, hopefully you're grabbing a hold of something. And I would say that fourth space of belonging is one of the most significant things because it is a medium. Structure is a medium. And it shapes you. And there's certain things that happen in certain environments, the medium really shapes the way things happen. So
I
think one thing that might be helpful just in a minute, if you could just talk about, because we didn't spend a lot of time on this, we all know public space, that's where we spend a lot of our time. If you could just outline what are like a couple of really good things public space is good for, and what is it not? I think we have a better idea of what it's not. It's not good for keep deciding. But you only spoke briefly. I think we need to hear what it is.
Okay, let's do that after a break,
Sure.
and I can try to do that. It's probably the least, least amount of time I've spent on, but I have. And obviously, like, what I find interesting is, like, obviously the gospel is written for us to understand these spaces. Just kind of, I'm thinking about if I were a disciple and if Jesus was the best disciple, if he was the master disciple maker, I think I probably want to figure out what he did and then maybe something to his methodology. That's what I'm saying. And I do think that when you just look at the crowds in public space, that we learn a lot of interesting things on that space. But I do have some things I can share, but like I'll have to do it a little bit after a break because I think we've been going for, how long have we been
We can go for a while. I think the schedule does be different, but this is a good time for a break.
Yeah.
All
I need
right,
a
great.
break.
All right, let's take a break and we'll pick it up.
15 minutes or so?
But there's just a couple of things I want to finish up this space with, and then kind of move into like fivefold intelligence. But I trust you kind of have some sense of what we're talking about when we talk about these four spaces. Again, personal space, disciple with want to become like Jesus. And my underlying assumption is that people learn more through imitation and immersion and mission than instruction. People do what you do. And again, that goes even deeper when it comes to imitation of desire, which people do subconsciously. If you want to learn more about that, like my recent book, Scale of Leadership, I try to give a nice summary of Gerard's thinking on mimetic desire. And that's very, very enlightening. And then, again, like, so space, what I've learned, and this is the is that when, let me actually kind of get to my notes here on this one, because there's some things I want to say. When mission is not the primary reason for social space, groups stagnate. When mission is the primary reason, they tend to flourish. This is just both from observation and talking, meaning like both in North America and in Europe. In particular, I'm talking about post-Christian context, which is very different than some other contexts. You know, Africa, Asia, like some of it where it's the first time coming into some spaces. That's very different context. We're in a place where there's more natural resistance built into people, right? And so, but these are true realities. I had an opportunity to be a field advisor for an examiner for various doctor ministry projects, speaking to this theme. So there's one qualitative study that took place in the Pacific Northwest, and it revealed, this is his words, missional communities or social space, in our words here. Because by the way, what that social space is called should be contextual. You know, what you name it, a village or whatever, like. But missional communities or social space struggle with missional engagement when community overshadows mission. Now, this study clarifies and really supports what I'm saying here. And I found this to be true, again, in dialogue with other movement leaders around, in particular North America and Europe and Australia. But a few years ago, I was on the phone with the senior network director for Alpha USA. I guess anybody familiar with Alpha? Kind of comes out of Trinity Brompton, like an 11-week course that's designed to help people really just kind of hear the story of God. So this guy is like senior director, so he's clearly an evangelist. We're going to talk about the fivefold here in a minute. And he's an apostolic evangelist, so he's an outgoing person, connecting with people, and he finds great delight in helping new people discover and follow Jesus. For 3 years, he and his wife were involved in planting what you call a house church in Phoenix, Arizona. But he was, at the end of that 3 years, he was super depressed. It was a difficult time for him and his wife and his family. And why is that for him? Because as an apostolic evangelist, they essentially did not see much growth. That the group kind of grew, and then it kind of just, kind of petered out. And yet, He had a kind of a fresh encounter with God, and through meeting leaders who were flourishing in mission, he basically flipped the script, and there was a dramatic change in his fruitfulness. So how did he flip the script? When community was the primary objective for social space, mission stagnated. But their community flipped the script. They made mission their primary objective for social space. In particular, they started to focus on the mission that Jesus cares about: the poor, the prisoner, the oppressed, the undocumented, and those captive to various addictions. And so making mission the primary focus of the social space, everything changed. Within a year and a half, they went from one kind of social space to over a dozen social spaces. They have the social spaces in recovery centers, prisons, Ys, veteran centers, retirement centers, and even strip joints. A half dozen women realize that Jesus loves strippers too, so they are building relationships with women at the local strip club. He flipped the script, and only after a year and a half, instead of one after 3 years, after a year and a half, they were in multiple places, a dozen. When social space is designed for mission, a place where you can connect your Christian friends with those who don't self-identify as Christian, it's also helpful to keep and remind you of the 6 primal needs. Because I think when you reflect on these in social space, I think the more needs that you can connect with those who are not yet self-identifying, the more vibrant it's going to be. And that's kind of, and I'll just leave with one last quote. By Roland Allen. He was a missionary to China and Africa, really turned the whole mission world upside down by what he was doing. He wrote a book called, one was A Spontaneous Expansion of the Church, which was kind of answering critiques to his first book called, I don't remember the title, but he says that the spontaneous expansion of the church, reduced to its elements, is a very simple thing. It asks for no elaborate organization, no large finances, and no great number of paid missionaries. The organization of a little church on the apostolic model is extremely simple, and the most illiterate converts can use it, and the poorest are sufficiently wealthy to maintain this. We see this with Leonardo Boff and some people in Latin America that started base communities, essentially social spaces that were led by the poor for the poor. And they've multiplied all over the world. It's very movemental. When I do my, I was telling some people that I'm going to be doing teaching a doctor at Fuller, Doctor of Global Leadership. It's an old doctor of missiology. And the first year when we meet, first we're going to be in Seoul, Korea. Like Seoul, Korea sends out more missionaries per capita than any place in the world. Per capita. U.S. probably still sends the most overall. So we're meeting in like Seoul, Korea to learn from that kind of movement orientation. And we're going to go to San Salvador and learn about base communities and liberation theology, and we're going to go to, because Fuller's in Pasadena, like near Azusa Street with the Pentecostal and Charismatic, and that's also spread. All of these things had some movement element to them. And what can we learn, especially as it relates to finding new paradigms that connect well with the 18 to 29-year-old emerging adult? Anyway, that's just a little. Roland Allen, though, is a great person to read. So he just studied deeply how Paul did this, and then wrote a book on it. And he's a early pioneer when it comes to missional and movemental thinking. But he was also quite critiqued in his time. Leslie Newbegin loved him, though. He did as one of the forwards. All right. Let me, are you guys, can we, is it okay to start this last thing before lunch? Thank you for flexibility of those of you who'd like to keep tight schedules. And then you can tell I'm not, what's the Myers-Briggs, the last two? I'm more of like a P. So.
You're not a J.
I'm not a J, so sorry for any J. All right, I'm not even in the right space. All right. So I just want to, we talked about there's one holistic gospel, 2 places of witness, 3 elements of the church, and 4 spaces of belonging. And now we want to look at this kind of fivefold intelligence. If someone could open up their Bible and prepare to read like Ephesians 4, 1 through 16, anybody? I want to do a quick introduction, but there'll be a time just to be ready.
Ephesians 4, 1 through 16.
1 through 16, yeah, not right now, but. So, here we're trying to look at the missional potential of the fivefold, which Hirsch has kind of called 5Q. My first book, Creating Missional Culture, gives like a chapter on each of these 5 types of what I call like vocational intelligence. It was Howard Gardner, professor at Harvard, who wrote the book Frames of Mind, the Theory of Multiple Intelligence, that kind of talks about all these various intelligence, not just IQ, but all of these ways, and different people are intelligent in a different way. So my goal isn't to go through that, just to share there's different intelligence. I'm kind of trying to introduce you to like what is 5Q, or this fivefold vocational intelligences that I think if you understand, and this has been something I've been living into like since the late 90s, and I think there's a number of other books besides mine that have come out on it. But I want to give you a quick overview of Ephesians. You guys probably already know it, taught on it. Like, it was probably one of his last letters. I like the way that Watchman Nee outlined it: sit, walk, stand. Right. First thing Paul tells us is that God chose us to be with Him. He adopted us as sons and daughters. By grace through faith, we have this opportunity to be a part of this new humanity He's created, and He seated us with Christ in this new atmosphere of love and grace, in a love that transforms us right from the inside out. And then after 3 chapters of seeing what the life, death, and resurrection of Christ accomplished for humanity, and just sitting with that, then you get to chapter 4, and then now this is how you walk it out, right? As you see and understand the plan and purpose of the world and bask in His love, Paul says, in light of this, we have to get up and walk, and then he urges us to live a life worthy of our calling, in light of the life, death, and resurrection, and this is where he starts to talk about the 4 fivefold intelligence. And then as we begin to live in the world for the sake of the world and the way of Christ, we start to participate with God in righting what is wrong. We will encounter an onslaught of the forces of darkness and the enemy of all that is good. And it's those times we have to rely on God's power and put on the armor and understand the spiritual warfare that comes, which is a big part of my last book, is a theology of the powers. That will happen if the kingdom of God, as it starts to enter in the kingdom of this world, there will be a level of conflict. That's always been the case. So at this point, let's, with that larger context, were you going to read Philippians 1 through 16? Nice and loud.
Therefore,
yeah, go ahead.
You want me to stand?
Yeah, go ahead.
Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean also? What does it mean except that he also has descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above all the heavens, so that he might fill all things. And he gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers, for equipping of the saints for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to a measure of stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects to him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love.
All right, so what are some things you heard there that come to your mind? I should probably ask that for you to listen to that in mind, but hopefully we're listening. What were anything that kind of stood out from that passage for you?
You want to face spiritual warfare, and you've got to stay strong.
Okay. I know we haven't had lunch yet, so let me. When I look at that passage, he first kind of is dealing with our attitude, right? What are some of the, be gentle, Humble, yeah. And then he moves to the common creed. There's one more, one faith, one baptism, one God above all, all in all. And that was an early, song, most people would say. And then he goes into these diversity of gifts. Christ has given the church apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers for what? The purpose of unity and maturity, that we might become the full stature of Christ. There's hardly many places that define how we can get the unity and maturity of the whole body. This is one of those passages. Now, was Jesus an apostle? Hebrews says yes. So if you believe he's part of the canon, then yes, you'd have to hold to that. Was he a prophet? Obviously. Was he an evangelist? Probably one of the best. Was he a pastor or shepherd? Yes. He was a good. Was he a teacher? Jesus was the archetypical apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher. That was his kind of lived reality. Now, we're told in this passage that Christ has given, these 5 intelligences to the church. So if attitude is important for us today, if this common creed is still true today, if unity and maturity today, the only way you're going to get it is with these understanding these fivefold intelligences and seeing them operate in the congregation. I would suggest we cannot do without any of them. So he starts with, what is this, sir? Oh, that's not the one I want. I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you receive. I think it's important to remember that this letter to Ephesus was to be read to the entire church. It wasn't just the leaders of the church. It was everybody was listening as a person, a part of it. So what does it mean to discover and live out our calling? A calling is not primarily about increasing our earning potential, status, or prestige. A calling refers to the fact that God made you and I with certain capacities. He embedded certain theogenetic codes in you and I, and if we're to partner with him to bring more of heaven to earth, then we need to understand how God has made us. Have you noticed it takes time to discern how we're to live out our particular calling? And by the way, calling and vocation are synonyms. Calling comes from the Anglo-Saxon root, while vocation comes from the Latin root, which mean the same thing. The Latin word vocation comes from the word voice. It comes from the word voice because discovering a calling involves carefully listening. It also implies that there is a caller. Vocation is not so much a goal that I pursue as it is a calling that I hear. And before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, it's wise to listen to my life telling me who I am. Parker has a whole book on that, right? There's a great gulf between the way my ego wants to identify me with its protective, masked, and self-serving fictions and my true self made in God. And it takes time and sometimes hard experiences to understand the difference between the two. Now, have you noticed that how common the seed analogy is in Scripture? It's because we learn a lot about the kingdom of God through in our lives about the seed from creation. Paul talked about the seed, which is I planted, Apollos watered, God causes the growth. And in many ways, the church in our lives are organic. So which of these flowers do you happen to like the best? The iris, the daisy, or the sunflower? How many say the iris? How many say the daisy? How many say the sunflower? All right. Yeah, broken up fairly evenly. Now, if I wanted to start a garden on my roof and I wanted it to have sunflowers, what would need to happen? I would need to get soil and get the right seed, and maybe some fertilizer and some plant food, and then water and take care of it. In the plant world, the nature of the flower is determined by the type of seed, which nourished with care develops and grows into all it was meant to be. And though we are much more than a plant, God has embedded into each of us, all of us, a theogenetic code. In other words, He has planted in us certain gifts, passions, talents, skills, personality, and His desire that we grow up in such a way as to honor the raw materials that He's given us. And when we get rooted deeply in His love, we can grow into all He desires us to be. Frederick Buechner has a wonderful statement about calling, and he says that calling is where your deepest hunger meets the world's deepest needs. Calling is when your deeper hunger, your passions, your gifts that God has placed in you, your theogenetic code, if you will, meet the tremendous need of the world which God has created you to meet. To miss out on your calling is to miss out on a large part of the reason why we were made by God. To fulfill your calling is a noble thing. That's the core of human existence. You watch people that are fulfilled in their callings, their motivation level is high, obstacles come along, they have an amazing endurance to overcome them, and they're growing and they're learning, and they have a joy in what they do. You watch somebody that's missing out on God's purpose for their life, and it's a shattering thing. To get to the end of your life and have missed out on your calling, that's shattering. Everybody has a calling. Every human being on this earth has a calling. You have a calling. There are no such things as uncalled human beings. And so Paul urges us to live our calling. And we must remember that first of all, we're called to know God, to know His love, to know His mercy, to receive His forgiveness, to live as His child. That's what the first 3 chapters are about. But God also embedded in you a theogenetic code that as you uncover and awaken will allow you to live life to the full. And so Paul says in verse 7, again, this was to the whole community. Wait.
You're one behind.
I'm one behind?
Go back.
Oh, I'm going the wrong way.
You're
Hey.
going the wrong way. You're going the wrong way.
Oh, jeez. Why am I got my hand on the wrong thing here.
You got one ahead of yourself. And then
All right. We'll go from the start. It's popping up here a little different than I'm used to, so where are we at now? Huh?
Polyvocation.
All right, yeah. Each one, this is what I wanted. To each one of us, grace has been given according to how Christ has apportioned it. And then we read next. Yeah, okay. So Christ Himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and the pastors, and the teachers to equip His people for the works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now notice that in this passage that the gifts given to people are not external gifts, but the people themselves are the gifts. These are, in other words, people gifts, or vocational intelligence, or theogenetic codes that have been planted in each of us. And when we discover it, it makes all the difference in the world. There's kind of 3 primary passages when it relates to the gifts. You have 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12, and Ephesians 4. Peter also has it there, but let's just look at these 3. Interesting enough, when it comes to 1 Corinthians, who is it that distributes the gifts? These are The Spirit, the Holy Spirit, as he or she, probably she is more a way to look at the Spirit, chooses to distribute them. That first initial gift list, or gifts of the Spirit, their healing, their faith, there's word of knowledge, there's things of that nature. Now he goes into a larger argument of prophecy and so forth that takes the whole, 11 through 13 type of thing, 11 through 14 maybe. But the key word there is the English translation is a manifestation. And these are somewhat situational gifts. And there's something that happens when we enter a call to Christ, the Spirit can give us. Then when it comes to Romans, the key Greek word at the beginning is action. And by the way, these are ones that the Father gives. And so they tend to be very practical. Ephesians 4 is where Christ himself is giving these people to the church. And the key word is calling, because they tend to be vocational intelligences. I would suggest, and I'll talk about, that these are in all of humanity, and when we answer our call to Christ, then he gives us to the church so that it's utilized for kingdom purposes and awakened to its full potential. And one of the places that we see that, and let's kind of, this is a passage that not many of us probably preach on, but I think it's important to understand. Paul says, but to each one of us grace has been given as Christ's proportionate. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended mean, except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. One of my friends, Andrew Dorset from the UK, has written a book that's not yet published on this fivefold. And one of the many contributions that he gives when he talks about the fivefold giftings is these five vocational intelligence, he talks about them being part of the natural and the created and the redeemed order. And so Paul kind of interjects Psalm 68:18 into this passage. And when you look at Psalm 68, you realize that it is a multi-layered depiction of God descending from Mount Sinai and ascending to Mount Zion, summarizing in poetic form the dramatic sweep of the history of God's people from the time of Moses to the time of David and Solomon. God descended from Sinai to deliver his people from captivity and then to dwell with his people and bring his people to the land that he promised to Abraham and his descendants. And this descent was with a purpose of bringing his people on a journey from the places of decisive liberation to the places of living out our freedom. His ascent on Zion represents his rule over all, and at the center of people set free in order that all the peoples might be blessed through them. So Ephesians 4, Jesus is described as having first descended to the earth and then ascended to the heavens. And so Paul is interpreting Psalm 68 as applying to or being fulfilled in Christ. The descent, referring to his incarnation, is the embodying of the Word of God to dwell among us, to show us how to live out the freedom that he has decisively worked out for us. And this is followed by his ascent to where Jesus is over all and in all. And that is to say that his life is lived out through us as he apportions it. And in his ascension, Jesus takes what was held captive and has been set free and makes it free indeed. Here's the point. Everybody made in the image of God reflects this fivefold intelligence. But when you surrender our lives to Christ, we're set free to the point that these theogenetic codes start to animate our lives for the good of the world. So in other words, being an apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher is what kind of God created you to be. And when we recognize that, like, for example, apostles, they tend to be the people who like to start things, entrepreneurs, if you will. Do you have to become a Christian to be an entrepreneur? Like, that intelligence is out there, right? Prophets are visionary activists posing important questions to our world in regard to social justice issues. Some of the most amazing people today in prophets are making, independent films and music that really poses important questions to society. And many are not yet Christians. Evangelists, every organization needs somebody to be the recruiter, sales and so forth. Pastors, they're like the nurturers, the counselors, the HR department, teachers, those who gather wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Like all of these are reflected in the creative order. Our identity is our identity, but our identity finds its fullest expression in covenant relationship and kingdom purpose. And so, let's look at what it might to be to discover our own, because this was written to everybody. So nobody here, I would suggest that each of us has a primary and secondary that even makes a subtype. You know, much like the Enneagram, you have your primary and your wing that creates a subtype. And so, let's. What I want to do is just kind of give you a picture of each of these, and then as you, at the end, I want to kind of ask you, who kind of identifies with that? Like, just to kind of get a sense. Okay.
I can appreciate your pointing out the resonances or the mirroring within the world, within
Yeah.
a non-converted population. But I do think it's important to point out that in this context here, he's talking particularly about the gifts to the church. And so we could perhaps suggest that outside the church, those things are given, but they don't find their realization, their purpose.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And notice though that as opposed to in Corinthians, the Spirit kind of comes upon and distributes. In this case, Christ gives the apostle to the church. In other words, this was already an intelligence that was there, and now he gives it to the church for kingdom purposes, right? So, but as opposed to a gift that comes upon us, this is the reason that calling is because it's intertwined into who we are, and that's why he gives people gifts to the church. I think that's right. So let's kind of look at these intelligence. The first is apostles. I think they're the people who like catalyze and commission others. They like to start new works and really kind of commission others to join God, the renewal of all things. They're the pioneers, always moving into new territory. Apostle literally means sent one, right? They cultivate. I would say I like to call them dream awakeners in the sense because they have the ability to awaken both individual and community dreams and help them live it out. If you're apostolic, you have you actually can see like the need for these other intelligence, and so you're able to see it, call it out, and bring it along with you. That's part of it. And the apostolic function tends to be able to wear most of those hats, not to the same degree that someone who has that as their primary intelligence, but you kind of have the ability to be kind of a jack of all trade type of person. I think the telos or the focal concern of apostles is helping communities live out their calling. The telos, or where they're trying to take any organization, or in this case the church, is creating a discipleship ethos, calling people to participate in seeing God's kingdom become more real. Apostolic people have a deep concern about whether the church is movemental or not, because they, maybe more than others, understand the commission is the world. The only one way we can be faithful to that is if we start to see the church through the lens of movement. And so they're going to help create a thriving environment in a congregation. Does this intelligence relate to anybody here? Who would? Cool. All right. Next is prophets. I call prophets heart revealers. They reveal the heart of God and the heart of the people. They kind of expose the wrong in the world, and they embody like a new way to be human in a new social society. So their focal concern is pursuing God's shalom, like the way things ought to be. This is wrong. This needs to be changed. They're calling the church to God's new social order, and they stand with the poor and the oppressed, and they're cultivating a liberating environment. They have a passion for social justice to seek that liberating people from personal sins, speaking truth to power, and social sins. And so when I was exploring which city, after planning a church at Virginia Tech, and during that time there, because it was a campus church, it wasn't like a self-sustaining financially ministry, so I raised money like a missionary, and over the years, our church, as we multiplied these mid-sized groups, we went from like 24 people to 1,200 before I left. 40 people came into full-time ministry and raised their own money through that one congregation. And then I brought a couple dozen to LA, and we simultaneously planted 3 churches in LA, whether that's a good idea or not. But it was a simple thing that we're talking about, right? Starting a discipleship core and social space in 3 different parts of the city. While I was trying to, but before we went to LA, the reason I was sharing that is like, I didn't know where we were going to go. Like, I was actually looking to be somewhere close to Virginia Tech. That seemed like a natural thing to think about, big city. And then I had my friend from India who got baptized by Leslie in the beginning. Now he's a pastor here, did his PhD here. And he knew we were looking to plant a church. He said, Jared, like, have you thought about Singapore? I go, no, I haven't. That wasn't coming across my mind. But he kind of made me back up and say, okay, yeah, what's kind of determining where we go? And we wanted to go to a place that was less people that self-identified as Christian and so forth and so on. Like, there's a lot of factors, probably 10 things. And so California kind of met that in general. And then, so we went to different cities in California. And by the way, like, I did before that question, I went down to Charlotte and I started talking to people, hey, like, we're thinking about planting church here. What are you thinking? One of the pastors said, well, we've got this area covered today. oh, you got everybody here. It's like the disciple of Jesus. But when we got to California, like every place we went, they were like the man from Macedonia, but right before my eyes. Come, we'll help you. We need you, like we have to. So we landed in LA for various reasons. And one of the pastors I met there was Pastor Ed, who was called to help this dying church in Hollywood. And at the one time, this church was very well known, attended by famous people, but just maybe 20, we're talking about like 20 years ago. I was at LA about 2002. So a while back, they only had 30 members left, all of them gray-haired Anglo-Saxons in a long since diversified neighborhood. And so a white flight had took place, and the remaining members of this church kind of commuted from the valley. The church was dying. The church did have this really beautifully wood-crafted choir loft, which was absolutely amazing. People idolized this beautifully handed choir loft. They could care less about the people living in the neighborhood. Well, the church was 280,000, and this, take this back to like 20-some years, 280,000 in debt by increasing 3,000 a month. Next door was a huge Scientology center, like 12 floors. So my friend Pastor Ed, and they were looking to buy the building, but my Pastor Ed was brought in as a last-ditch effort in order to try to turn this chance around. Anything thing to know about him is like he became a Christian like in his 40s. His job before he was turning around businesses that were filed Chapter 11 and then helping them overcome. And then he became a Christian. And then he started turning around existing churches. Interesting, right? That created redemptive order. So my friend Pastor was brought in last ditch effort. A few weeks after interviewing, the church board decided to accept him as their pastor. It's a Baptist church, the congregation. And despite looking like the congregation with his pale skin and gray hair, he brought a very different type of understanding to the congregation. Now, there are different ways to do this. I'm not necessarily, saying this isn't the only way, but sometimes, you use shock treatment, and that's kind of what he did here. The morning that Pastor had the first sermon, it started like any other Sunday morning. He was dressed nicely. They're sitting there singing their hymnals. The congregation sat eager to listen to the message of their newly acquired pastor. I mean, it was sunny outside. The birds are chirping. And so he starts to share his message. And in the middle of the message, Pastor Ed pulled out a sledgehammer from behind the podium, and he started to bang at the choir loft, which he felt like they were idolizing. And then he said, if you want to be a part of this congregation, you come and take this, and you take a bang at the choir loft as well. There was a blessed subtraction from 30 to 10. However, within about 2 years, that whole church was filled up with people reflective of that neighborhood. something had to die before it could be resurrected again. And that's part of what a prophet likes to do. So how many think you might have some prophetic vocational intelligence? Not necessarily like that, but like social justice, then you have to others, yeah. Anybody prophetic? All right. Prophets still want to identify? All right. All right, then we have the evangelists. They kind of like to invite people to the kingdom, excite the congregation when it comes to helping other people. Their focal concern is incarnating the good news, that we're both living it out and proclaiming the good news by being witnesses and redemptive agents. They're the ones who like to cultivate like a welcoming environment. Whether it's social space or public space, they're always looking with kind of that person that doesn't self-identify as a Christian, and how is this potentially connecting with them? And so while social space for us was always the front door, there was a time where we were going through, when I was in LA, I think it was about an 8-week series on Jesus. His life, his message, his death, and the resurrection. And there was, I met a lady who kind of introduced herself to me after maybe after the first part of that series. And she said, "Hey, my name is Latifa, and I'm a Muslim, and I just wanted to thank you, dear, for creating a welcoming environment here. I've been to a number of other churches, and as soon as I tell them I'm a Muslim, I feel, this invisible wall comes up. But I don't feel that here. So just wanted to thank you for that." Well, she didn't feel that there, so I guess, she came for this whole series. And everybody knew her because she was kind of a character. And our space wasn't that big. It probably could hold 150 people, so there's a balcony, and probably not much bigger than the size of this room. And so she was sitting right there in the middle where Jane is at. And I had just finished the last part of the series and getting ready to pray. And Jane just jumps up on her seat. "Jesus is Lord! Jesus is Lord! Jesus is Lord!" And then she falls to her knees in tears. And the whole congregation was watching us. Because we created a welcoming community for her. Who kind of feels you might have the evangelist kind of intelligence? Anybody? Cool.
Jay, are you saying that in your experience, everybody has one of these?
Yeah, everyone has a primary and probably secondary.
One of these?
Yes,
five?
yes.
Yeah. And these 5 names have been so co-opted by the ecclesiastical establishment that they seem to be used by us only for people who are specialized and trained in seminaries or other ways. The sense that at some level, one of these 5 intelligences belongs to everybody.
Yeah.
As a primary thing. That's a radical thought.
Yeah, and I think you could kind of see, if you look at the landscape, like a lot of planters or that are heavy into practitioner, when just in a very general way, I'm not thinking of any particular denomination or group, they tend to orient around practice and doing things. The teachers are all gathered at the seminary. The spiritual formation people have their own category. And we kind of, put them all out. But in order to reach the union, and I think all of those are helpful elements. But they're in this room. These intelligences are in this room. Every one of them is represented, primary and secondary. And that's what enables the body growth. I did an experiment when I lived in LA. Remember that group I started with dinner and just sharing a story? Well, when we got about 22 people over like 3 or 4 months, there were some Christians that were part of that. So they, when are we going to pray? Oh, tell me why prayer is important for you. When are we going to study the scripture? Oh, tell me why that is. When are we going to continue to do something in our neighborhood. Like they were, by their very questioning, telling me their vocational intelligence. Because maybe the back door and understanding your vocational intelligence, or maybe even the people who are a part of your congregation, is the things they complain about might be the things that they already see should be happening, and maybe they should be partly doing it. Partly is reflective of I think, their intelligence and what's not being fully there. I would also say that, one of the reasons I'm for shared leadership and multiple people communicating up front is because it's ideal for people that have different types of vocational intelligence. We communicate differently. And the community will naturally, if the leader is a good person, they tend to model and tend to orient around that. And we can sometimes just gather a bunch of people that are either teachers or pastors or whatever, because because potentially the leader will elevate that particular intelligence above the others. And some people will not feel a part. And this is, by the way, why the parachurch started, because the apostolic had no place in the inherited church. Nobody honored their vocational intelligence, and so they went off and did their own thing. That will happen. Apostolic person can't just sit around and not see something continue and multiply. They just won't. So we can either choose to accept who they are, give them a place, and help them live it out, or we will pay the consequences in some ways, through maturity and through what the church needs to do. Pastors, maybe we're most familiar with, but I kind of call them soul healers, because I don't know, here, you guys have, Episcopal has different labels, but a lot of people that are leaders are called pastors. And there gets to be a confusion between that title and this vocational intelligence. There are some pastors that are far away from the pastor as I'm trying to describe it here. Just because someone has a title doesn't mean that's their vocational intelligence. In fact, I don't think it's even helpful to give these as titles. I think it's better to think about the function of that gift. And by the way, so pastors, they guard the community from wolves, guide them towards still waters. They're the nurturers, the protectors. I like to call them soul healers. Their focal concern is seeking holiness and wholeness by cultivating a life-giving spirituality within the community, helping the community embody reconciliation, be a sense of family. They're trying to create environments where people can find a sense of healing. And and so how many would kind of have maybe pastoral vocational intelligence? Any pastor? Any director? All right. And then we have teachers. Teachers, I call them light givers in the sense that because they help interpret and the text and inform people. So their focal concern is helping the community inhabit the sacred text. And the telos is that we would immerse ourselves in Scripture and dwell faithfully in God's story. So they're cultivating a learning environment where the whole body is growing in knowledge, wisdom, and maturity. Anybody identify as teacher? Okay, cool. All right. Let me kind of share the story about a teacher as a little bit of inspiration. This story is Elizabeth Ballard of Chesapeake. Virginia tells us often about this teacher named Miss Jean Thomas. Have anybody heard of this? Each September, Miss Thomas greeted her new students with the words, "Boys and girls, I love you all the same. I have no favorites." Of course, she wasn't being fully truthful. Teachers do have favorites. And what's worse, they sometimes have students that they just don't like. Teddy Stoller was a boy Miss Thomas just didn't like, and for good reason. He was a bad-tempered boy who sat slouched in his seat with his head down. When she spoke to him, he always answered in monosyllables, yes, no. His clothes were musty and his hair unkempt. He was an unattractive boy in just about every way. And whenever she marked Teddy's paper, she got this certain perverse delight on putting an X next to the wrong answers. And then when she put the F at the top of the paper, she always did it with a flair. She should have known better. Teachers have records, and she had records on Teddy. First grade, Teddy shows promise in his work and attitude, but poor home situation. Second grade, Teddy's a good boy, but he's too serious for a second grader. His mother is terminally ill. Third grade, Teddy is becoming withdrawn and detached. His mother died this year. His father shows no interest. Fourth grade, Teddy is a troubled child. He needs help. Christmas came. The children brought presents to Miss Thompson. They piled them on her desk. They crowded around to watch her open them, and all the presents were wrapped brightly colored paper except for Teddy's present. It was wrapped in a brown paper bag held together with Scotch tape. But to tell the truth, she was surprised he even brought a gift. So she tore open the paper, and out fell a rhinestone bracelet with most of the stones missing and an almost empty bottle of cheap perfume. The other children giggled at the shabby gifts, but Miss Thomas had enough sense to snap on the bracelet and take some of that perfume and put it on her wrist. And then holding her wrist out to the other children, she says, "Isn't it lovely?" The other children, taking their cue from the teacher, all agreed. Mimetic desire there. At the end of the day, when all the children had left, Teddy came over to her desk and said softly, "Miss Thompson, all day today you smelled just like my mother used to smell. That's her bracelet you're wearing. It looks very nice on you, and I'm really glad you like my presents." After she left, she got down on her knees, buried her head in her hands, and cried and cried and cried, and asked God to forgive her. The next day, when the children came to class, they had a new teacher. It was still Miss Thompson, but she was a new teacher. She cared in ways that the old teacher didn't. She reached out in ways that the old teacher didn't. She reached out to all the children, but especially to Teddy. She nurtured them, encouraged them, and tutored them when they get extra help. So by the time that school ended, Teddy had caught up with a lot of the children, and he was ahead of some. Teddy moved away, and Miss Thompson didn't hear from him for a long time. Then one day, seemingly out of nowhere, came a note. "Dear Miss Thompson, I'm graduating from high school, and I wanted you to be the first to know. Love, Teddy Stoller," and there was no address. 4 years later, there was another short note, and it read, "Dear Miss Thompson, I wanted you to be the first to know I'm second in my class. The university hasn't been easy, but I really liked it. Love, Teddy Stoller." And then 4 years later, there was still another note. "Dear Miss Thompson, as of today, I am Theodore J. Stollard, MD. How about that? I wanted you to be the first to know I'm going to be married the 27th of July to be exact. I want you to come, and I want you to sit where my mother would have sat. You're the only family I have now. Dad died last year. Love, Teddy Stoller." And she went, and she sat where Teddy's mother would have sat because she deserved to be there. She was a teacher who did something great for the kingdom of God, and she deserved her reward. As we unpack our theogenetic code and start to live into what God has made us, as you water and cultivate the seed planted in you, you might find yourself having a calling instead of just a career. And there is a difference. John Ortberg puts it this way: American society doesn't talk much about calling anymore. It's more likely to think in terms of career. Yet for many people, a career becomes the altar on which they sacrifice their lives. Benjamin Hedicott, a historian who specializes in the history of work at the University of Iowa, he notes that work has become our new religion, where we worship and give our time. As people's commitment to family, community, and faith are shrinking, they begin to look to their careers to provide them with meaning and connectedness and identity and esteem. A calling, which is something I do for God, is replaced by a career which threatens to become my God. You see, a career is something I choose for myself. A calling is something that I receive. A career is something I do for myself. A calling is something I do for God. A career promises status and money and power. A calling, while it may come with some of those things, generally promises difficulty and even suffering and the opportunity to be used by God. You know, when I went into full-time ministry, people might often say, "Hey, when did you get the call?" As if church work required the calling, but marketplace job was just a part of a career. But that's not how it goes. I know all too well that it's possible to turn church work into a career that's about advancement and achievement, but it's also possible to make a business a calling when it's truly done in service to God and others. A career may end with retirement and lots of toys. A calling isn't over until the day you die. I noticed that by some of you guys here who are, quote, retired. You can't retire from your calling. The rewards of a career may be quite visible, but they're temporary. The significance of a calling lasts for eternity. A career can be disrupted by a number of events, but not a calling. When God calls people, He enables them to fulfill their callings even in the most unlikely circumstances. Scripture is full of people who were pressed into slavery, captured and sent into exile, thrown into prison. Their career trajectories did not look promising, but they fulfilled their calling in extremely extraordinary ways. Pharaoh had a career, but Moses had a calling. Potiphar had a career, but Joseph had a calling. Haman had a career, but Esther had a calling. Ahab had a career, but Elijah had a calling. Pilate had a career, but Jesus had a calling. What about you? Let's pray. Thank you, God, that you have implanted in us, each of us, a theogenetic code. You've given us certain passions and certain abilities. Might we be in touch with them, because it's to help us to understand what our calling is. And Lord, thank you that you've called all of us. And you called us to a huge task. And every part of the body is needed if we're going to grow in unity and maturity. And so I pray each person here would have a greater sense of what their calling is as they reflect more on the fivefold gifting. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Why don't we just take a little, because maybe take a little time just to talk about over the couple of sessions, like what's your biggest takeaway, and what's something that's kind of developed more curiosity for you?